So now it's time for our first panel, the human rights and the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. And we're so lucky to have Dr. Ian Beckford as the moderator of this panel. So I will introduce him, and then Ian, I will turn it over to you to introduce the panelists and also the short film that you have as part of your panel. Dr. Ian Beckford has served as the president of the American University of Afghanistan since 2021, steering the university through a period of significant change. Prior to joining AUF, he was the inaugural provost of Fulbright University, Vietnam, where he led the establishment of Vietnam's first American-style liberal arts and science undergraduate program. Dr. Beckford also served as provost, vice president, and dean of Bard Academy of Bard College. I'll turn it over now to Professor Beckford to introduce the panelists and lead the discussion, and as well as the Q&A session.
Thank you, Dr. Farhadi. I'd like to thank the University of South Florida for having us here and the coordinators of this gathering, which is a profound occasion. I'm a substitute, which is great because I started my career as a substitute high school teacher in Dearborn, Michigan. I'm here in place of Ambassador Greta Holtz, who I would like to thank for convening this exceptional panel. We will invite the panelists to the stage in just a few moments, and I'll introduce them at that time. Because we're on a university campus, indulge me in just one reflection. As you heard from Dr. Farhadi, my own background is in very few of the things that represent the expertise gathered in this room, but rather Shakespeare and Milton. And so I'd like to share a very brief anecdote that I've repeated before, but I think is relevant to the occasion. The 1964 Democratic National Convention happened just weeks after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And the question in the room, awarding profound new powers to the President of the United States, President Johnson, in Southeast Asia. At that occasion, the big question in the room was in what way President Johnson would enact those powers. And for the moment, he was practicing restraint. But there was a delegation of international diplomats visiting the Democratic National Convention. And the delegate from Pakistan was sitting in a room convened by then ambassador to the UN, Adlai Stevenson. And the delegate from Pakistan asked the question, should the United States exercise greater military power in Southeast Asia? To which Ambassador Stevenson answered with one sentence, really a question. What is strength without a double share of wisdom? What is strength without a double share of wisdom? Now, this is a quotation from John Milton's late poem, Samson Agonistes. And it's a question that I think should guide all of our thought today. And it's a question that this panel is convened to answer and to provide the wisdom in its double share. We'd like to begin with thanks to Ambassador Holtz for making this possible with a segment of the film, The Sharp Edge of Peace, by Roya Sadat. This is about 14 minutes, so the panelists will join me on the stage after the conclusion of the film. We thought it would be good to take part of the time of this panel for a framing narrative, if you will. And the film will inform part of our discussion. Thank you.
It's a sobering but meaningful articulation of where we are. I'd like to begin by introducing our panelists, and then we'll have questions for them. Ambassador Saeed Jawad is a distinguished and decorated diplomat. As Afghanistan ambassador to the United States, the UK, and Russia, he was chief of staff to President Karzai. and held several other critical roles in the Afghan government. And not least, he is the chair of the board of the American University of Afghanistan. Dr. Halima Kazim is the associate director of Stanford University's program in feminist gender sexuality studies. Dr. Kazim's work is deeply rooted in feminist methodologies and 26 years of working as a journalist, lecturer, human rights researcher, oral historian, and filmmaker. Her research is in areas of gender, empire, human rights, and media, with a focus on Afghanistan. And her upcoming book, A Feminist History of Afghanistan, Resisting the Erasure of Women, unearths and narrates the little-told story, the feminist history of women's movements in Afghanistan. Scott Worden is Director of Afghanistan and Central Asia Programs at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He comes into the role with an extensive background in reconstruction, development, democracy, and governance, policy, among others, as well as extensive regional expertise in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Before that, he was director of the Lessons Learned program at the Office of the Special Inspector General of Afghanistan Reconstruction, which we know as SIGAR, and served as acting director of policy as well as a senior policy advisor for the Office of Afghanistan and Pakistan Affairs at the United States Agency for International Development, which we know as USAID. And Nahid Sarabi is a non-resident senior fellow in the Center for Sustainable Development, housed within the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. She is also a director and co-founder of the Institute for Development and Economic Affairs, IDEA, a US-based think tank for the Afghan diaspora. Nahid is a development and economic policy practitioner with over 15 years of experience in development policy and planning, and she served as Deputy Minister for Policy at the Ministry of Finance in Afghanistan from 2017 to 2020. That was the highest-ranking professional woman at the ministry in the pre-Taliban administration. I'd like to begin, Ambassador Jawad, if I may, by asking you to help us set the stage. Can you speak to the regional dimension of the situation in Afghanistan and the various multilateral and bilateral diplomatic efforts that are, or let's say should be, addressing humanitarian needs? Are regional actors and organizations actively engaged to the extent that they might be in mitigating these challenges, in delivering aid and delivering on promises in Afghanistan?
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I would like to thank Adib Farhadi, my dear friend, and the University of South Florida for giving us opportunity. I'm delighted to be with such a distinguished panelist. And I would like to thank also those who have served in Afghanistan. There are also some members of ANDSF here that served in Afghanistan. Their services are also equally appreciated. It's an important question, the role of the regional power, our neighbors, and multilateral regional organizations in mitigating the humanitarian crisis and dealing with certain aspects of human rights crisis in Afghanistan, because the expectation was much higher with the U.S. withdrawal that countries like China, Russia, or organizations such as SARC or Shanghai Cooperation Organization will move into that space and provide actually better framework for peace, but also, more importantly, more investment and economic assistance. That did not materialize. And if we see the role of, for instance, SARC, which is a more India-dominated organizations, or Shanghai Cooperation Organizations, they are almost completely withdrawn. They were not expected to play a much role when U.S. was there, but by now they play almost no significant role in the crisis. And Afghan naturally expect actually a bigger role by the UN because of the history of UN involvement in the political and humanitarian support to Afghanistan. But that was a different day. That was where there was a strong consensus among the international partners to support US. There were more resources available to And also, we had some really good leaders that served in Afghanistan as part of the UN teams, like Mr. Lakhdar Brahimi, like Jean Arnault and others. So we don't have these kind of statesmen that is leading the efforts of the UN in Afghanistan, except for Richard Bennett, that I have a lot of respect for, and we don't. The UN lack the resources that it needs. So that expectation is also by Afghans is not met, and it will not be met. Same thing true if you look at the role of actually the countries in the region briefly. I don't want to take up too much time, but Pakistan, for instance, was expecting to be a more stabilizing force. The assumption was that the Taliban are closely coordinated with them. But there's a lot of different readings of the role of Pakistan. Some still think that actually that Pakistan plays an important role in managing and controlling Taliban, but there are evidence of lack of cooperation and coordination between Pakistan on important issues such as counterterrorism. That's very important for Pakistanis. And China, early on was mentioned that China is interested or deeply engaged in economic sphere in Afghanistan. It's not. Really, China's role is very insignificant in Afghanistan. Diplomatically, their economic interest in Afghanistan, and that was even back during the time of the Republic, that Afghan government gave some of the best concession to Chinese companies, copper and iron ore and other, but they never actually start any activities. So now also the relationship is a lot more formal and more focused on counterintelligence and counterterrorism. And that is also an issue that we'll talk about it actually in the context of Central Asia, that with our other important neighbors, Iran has changed actually the nature of its relation with Taliban. It elevated actually kind of the relation with Taliban on a more strategic level, with having direct contact with Kandahar and Mullah Abatullah instead of working with some sub-commanders like Ibrahim Sadr and others that used to work with them. So they have, it's one country that probably has the more closer contacts and relation and access to Kandahar than anyone else, probably even more than Pakistan when it comes to the case of Kandahar, not the entire Taliban set up in both places. And there is with increased tension with the United States, there's an interest of Iranian to get closer to Al-Qaeda as a strategic regional asset for them, and of course ISIS-K is another issue that Taliban and Iran are both interested to cooperate as these forces are re-emerging in Afghanistan. The case of Central Asia is more interesting. It was mentioned also in the earlier discussions that Uzbekistan is really interested into the economic reintegration, but the nature of the relation of the Central Asian countries is complicated. I was ambassador to Moscow when the negotiation was taking place in Doha and others, so the Moscow position was more or less that Taliban are an extremist group, but the Central Asian countries should not worry about them that much because they're kind of in our pocket. We can manage and control actually Taliban, and through them control other actually extremist groups that operate out of Afghanistan by having good relation with Taliban. But what Uzbekistan and others did wisely, and a lot of these people who are in charge of the intelligence and security institution in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, lesser degree Turkmenistan, are people that are left over from Soviet's time. So they have operated in Afghanistan. They know Afghanistan. So they thought, well, we can have a better relation with Taliban than you, Moscow. We don't need you for this. And of course, with Ukraine happening, the Central Asian countries got more space to choose actually a foreign and intelligence and security policy that's a little bit independent from Moscow. So they used this opportunity. They got even much closer to Taliban. Uzbekistan got much closer to Taliban than Moscow is. Moscow is an issue of mutual disappointment. Taliban were expecting that Moscow will recognize them, will bankroll their economy, will give them a lot of assistance. But the Russian didn't deliver. They normally have given the embassy that I was ambassador to Taliban, but the Taliban diplomats have put under restriction. They cannot travel. Actually, it's nominal. And The reason is that there are at least 5 different organizations that look into Afghanistan from Russia, Office of the President, National Security Advisor, and 3 different intelligence agencies. And so the information that they get from Afghanistan about the degree of cooperation of Taliban on counterterrorism front does not match what Taliban is telling them. Because they do have a strong intelligence presence, and there's a Ministry of Interior in Russia is looking into counter-narcotics, and they have their own agents and activities. So that relationship, and again, it's a mutual disappointment and mistrust. It's a limited engagement, and Taliban have not used actually some of the capacities that the former Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Afghanistan had. So they're sending diplomats that usually, and not only to Russia or to other countries, China and others, they don't speak the language. They have not. The expectation have not materialized, and therefore the humanitarian crisis that takes place in Afghanistan continues severely. We are not only facing unemployment or restriction of the human rights that was indicated clearly, but drought, unemployment, so many catastrophes. But there's no coordination, there's no plan. Neither China nor Iran nor Pakistan, none of these countries is helping Afghans in Afghanistan in a significant way. And that actually leaves Afghanistan in a very difficult situation right now, both in human rights front, but also humanitarian crisis. I'll end here, thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Halima, I'm so glad you're here because I think you can help us. The themes of this panel, humanitarianism, human rights, are terms that are defined and redefined, theorized and re-theorized over time. They tend to slide. And I'd like to ask you first to talk to us about how you would like us to think about those terms as a framework for this panel. And then, if you can talk about a subject that's very important to me and my colleagues, how does the Taliban's ban on women and girls' education and other areas of civic life complicate the way the world addresses human rights and humanitarianism in Afghanistan now?
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, everybody, for being here. As a former journalist, I was a journalist before I was an academic, so I'll stay true to my roots and give you a very concrete example from my time in Afghanistan. In 2006, 2007, I co-authored the United Nations Human Development Report. The following years, I worked as a women's rights researcher on Afghanistan for Human Rights Watch, and then human rights researcher on Afghanistan for Amnesty International. So deeply rooted in traveling and speaking to people, those were my experiences. I spent many years doing field work on human rights in Afghanistan. I root my opening comments today in those experiences because I want to provide a concrete example for a human rights issue and perhaps a lesson that needs to be learned, since we're talking about lessons with so many of our Afghanistan War Commission folks here. I want to provide a concrete example for a human rights issue and perhaps a lesson that needs to be learned, and perhaps we can conceptualize human rights beyond the liberal script and notions of democracy, and I'll explain that. The 2007 Afghanistan Human Development Report, which was titled Bridging Modernity and Tradition, the Rule of Law and the Search for Justice, that was the title that we worked very hard to bring forward. My co-authors, Dr. Ali Wardak and Dr. Daoud Sabah, and I traveled to many provinces and met with local shuras and jirgas, the traditional dispute resolution councils that settle local disputes on a weekly basis or more often in many places all over Afghanistan. Has a long history of resolving disputes. From those experiences, we recommended a hybrid system which integrated the informal justice mechanisms, such as the shuras and the jirgas, with the Ministry of Justice, which was building muscle and authority under the Republic in 2006 and 2007. Both systems had their complications, strengths, and weaknesses, but the goal was to harness the strengths of both and build a justice system that could serve more of the country and have accountability. Jirgas and shuras would be registered at the Ministry of Justice, and their decisions would be reviewed and recorded to comply with human rights norms, especially those protecting women, children, and minorities. So this was the plan. This was what the outcomes of the report were. This is what we suggested in what we proposed in the report. However, this is where the lesson is. As the team of authors, we faced a lot of pushback and even threats by Afghan and international counterparts. The idea was not part of the liberal script of human rights being implemented in Afghanistan. The UN Development Program took their name off of our report. That's how controversial this got. And our team of authors were summoned to the Afghan Supreme Court. Private discussions proved that many thought this was one type of solution, but this didn't comply with an international and aid-driven justice agenda. So those are that was a deep, deep experience that I realized that there was a different level of an agenda that one person, one institution wasn't controlling. The consequences of a liberal human rights framework in Afghanistan from 2001 until 2021, these were the consequences. There were definite achievements in human rights, such as the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission, many human rights documentation projects going back many decades. Most of those gains have been lost since August 2021. And one of the biggest threats is that we don't even have an accurate picture of the atrocities because documentation of abuses has ceased. Since taking power, as we saw in Roya Sadat's documentary, the de facto authorities have issued more than 80 edicts, directives, and statements which specifically target and restrict the rights of women and girls. You may have heard the slogan, non-kar azadi, food, work, freedom. This preceded the protest chants of the women in Iran. This was the chant of the women in Afghanistan right after the Taliban takeover, and they were asking for their basic human rights. The call made by women and girls who marched on the streets of Kabul, Herat, and other places. The Taliban's deliberate subjugation of women and girls is widespread and systematic, as many of you already know, amounting to crimes against humanity, including the crime of gender persecution. We have violently departed in Afghanistan and globally from a common understanding of what is human anymore. Women have been reduced to their reproductive capacity and biological properties. In this context, for the women and girls in Afghanistan, right now we must stop and think. When it comes to human rights, how do we think of human anymore? Are we post-human now? As an academic, I think of post-eras and pre-eras and periodization. Something to think about for this group, as I look across and see a lot of people in the diplomatic space, the humanitarian space, and the military space, is to think about what we do when we normalize the de facto authorities or their human rights violating regime, particularly their institutionalized system of discrimination, segregation, disrespect for human dignity, and exclusion of women and girls. It's a long answer to your question, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you, Halima, and I appreciate the thoroughness of your response versus length. In the same spirit, Scott, thank you for being here, and thank you for representing USIP, which focuses on concrete goals and solutions. And so I'd like to ask you, what can we conclude from the trajectory of the Taliban's policies and practices over the last 3 years? And are there any potential strategies to improve the situation going forward?
Just that simple question.
Very simple.
First, let me start by thanking the University of South Florida and you all for having me here. Halima, I think you articulated better than I can, and I won't dwell on the current situation, but just to give my summary that Afghanistan is the worst place in the world to be a woman or a girl right now. And while a lot of attention has been rightly focused on the lack of education, which is so fundamental, it really is a litany of rights abuses, of treaty violations that the Taliban has committed. And I would say, agreeing with your point, the documentation, more documentation is needed. The role that Richard Bennett, the UN Special Rapporteur for the situation of human rights in Afghanistan, is vital. And I recommend that everybody read his reports and read them over time, because it is critical to one of my points, which is that the situation is bad, but it is getting worse. And it has steadily gotten worse over 3 years. I'll focus my remarks on the human rights situation, where I and USIP's work more focuses. But the humanitarian situation is also terrible. It's been eclipsed by maybe more acute disasters in Gaza, in Sudan, in some others, but it remains one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, with 23 million out of 40 million Afghans, according to the UN, in need of vital humanitarian assistance. And we can bring that back around to the situation of women and girls, which is to say that women and girls bear the burden of poverty and all of those humanitarian needs even more than men. I mentioned the trend is getting worse. Richard Bennett writes reports every 6 months, and some special reports, particularly focusing on women and girls. And when you read through them, there's a depressing standardization of the situation is bad, but it is worse. And you mentioned all the Taliban decrees. I'll also give just one short plug for the U.S. Institute of Peace website, where we track and catalog each successive Taliban decree that affects women's rights and human rights. And it is unfortunately a growing list. I think this trend can be focused on and crystallized, however, by the more recent, in August, passage of a law rather than a decree or an edict or a speech at a mosque, which is a law on preventing vice and promoting virtue, using the Taliban's vocabulary. This is over 100 pages. It is heavily footnoted. It has been passed with a deliberative process by the Taliban, although not following the Constitution. So this is really a marker to say, okay, 3 years into their rule, we're really serious about this. And some looked at the beginning, maybe gave the benefit of the doubt, maybe were optimistic that indeed we have Taliban 2.0, it was called. They've learned some lessons. They'll be a bit softer on the human rights and particularly women's rights front. And they themselves said to the international community, to allies, to the region, well, we need time to establish our system. These are temporary measures. Unfortunately, with this PVPV law, preventing vice and promoting virtue, I think they've laid a marker down that is no longer interim. They're serious. So what does that mean, and what do we do about it? I think there have been a couple theories of change, if you will, that are put forward as to why the Taliban are doing this, and I think spending some time trying to figure out why they're doing it is necessary to come up with an adequate response. One that's been posed is that Hibatullah and the hardliners, the core religious conservatives in Kandahar, are doing this to protect their flank, if you will. They fought a violent jihad. So many, in their terms, of their fighters were martyred for the cause of Sharia and a more pure Islam, and they don't want to lose them. They don't want to lose them to more radical groups like ISIS. So holding a hard line is a way to keep the movement together. I'm doing these, by the way, in order of what I think is probably the right answer. Second would be leverage. The West, the US in particular, but a coalition of like-minded allies obviously care quite a bit, as well as the Afghan people, for human rights. And this might be a way to build up a bargaining chip relatively cheaply. Okay, well, if we cut off schools, then we can barter that for recognition and not give on other things. The third, and what I think is more likely, and these are not mutually exclusive, but I think the core part is that at least Hibatullah and those around him in Kandahar, this is the goal. This is not a bug, it's a feature of the system. They actually, they have a vision, their vision, which is not in accordance, from what scholars say, with classical Islam, of having a pure Islamic system, the best in the world, the best in the region, and it's also infused by particularly Pashtun traditions and culture as they experience them, but I think lots of Afghans, including on this stage, would disagree with. So if it's a core goal, that means they're not going to give it up easily, they're not going to bargain with it, and there's not really a framework for horse trading here. That all leads me to say that this is unfortunately going to be a long battle, but one that I think has been articulated is worth fighting. And I would say not just, I'm obviously not Afghan and not speaking for Afghans, but I would say looking at US interests and international interests, not only are there international commitments to universal, and I underscore universal human rights in the UN Charter and related treaties that we've signed on to, but there is a security dimension to this as well, because we're talking about real core interests in terms of ISIS-K, in terms of Al-Qaeda, in terms of other groups. If we look at a safe haven, if we look over time at what produces terrorist risk, extremism, violent extremism, it is indeed an education system, an environment that is being built in Afghanistan. Exclusion of women is one part of that, that creates generational change with sympathy toward violent jihad. So there's a security aspect to this as well as a rights aspect. What to do about it? I think that the core issue is that human rights, women's rights, needs to be incorporated into the broader diplomatic framework by which the US, but also the international community engages with Afghanistan. In fact, we have that framework partially articulated, but the UN Special Coordinator, Senator Liu Liu, wrote a report that was endorsed by the UN Security Council in December of 2023 that laid out all of the problems of Afghanistan and pointed out, well, the interrelationship between the economic, the humanitarian, the political, the security, and the rights environment, highlighting that when he went around with his team in Afghanistan and talked to Afghans, women's rights across the spectrum was one of the #1 concerns. So there's a framework for that. There is no UN Special Envoy, which was called for and endorsed by the Security Council yet. But with or without an envoy, there have been a series of Doha meetings convened by the UN to look at different aspects of the problem. And the end goal of this is to identify what the Special Coordinator termed a roadmap to normalization. And he said normalization, not recognition. So that roadmap needs to include all elements. And I think it's worth revisiting and reconsidering that in the UN framework as well as in different national frameworks to say, okay, how can we engage Afghanistan? I take the point earlier that not turning your back on your enemies is a good strategy. But at the same time, how to bring human rights into the conversation because it's part of the holistic stability and welfare of Afghanistan. I'm concerned, I will say, that the trend on that is negative. The Taliban were not invited to the second Doha meeting, civil society was, but then they were invited to the third meeting and insisted on the exclusion of civil society and women's rights activists, and that was granted. I will end by just saying that I am skeptical of a theory of change that goes by what maybe works in other places as a standard diplomatic escalation. Work on low-hanging fruit, focus as the Taliban were asking for on private sector development, on counter-narcotics. These are indeed mutual interests. But I don't see anything in the Doha negotiations that Ambassador Khalilzad conducted or in the Taliban's behavior since they took over power to suggest that working on these smaller issues where there might be mutual agreement actually provides a rung of a ladder to get up to what are more difficult issues. And I think therefore addressing this all at once in a head-on way is the way to go.
Thank you, Scott. Before I turn to our final panelists, I would like to remind the audience that you can ask questions on note cards or on your app, and we would very much like to have questions from the room. And I don't see any questions yet from the app. Gentle reminder. Naheed, you're an economist, and you were deeply and broadly involved with imagining a new Afghan economy. Is there a viable economic development pathway available for the country now? To what extent does it rely on the international community and humanitarian aid? And if you can you talk to us about both the short term and the long term and how we pivot from, or how Afghanistan pivots from short-term planning to long-term planning.
Thank you so much, Ian. Very honored to be here. Thank you, Dr. Farhadi and Yusuf, for having me here. It's very difficult to talk about economy sitting in a venue close to CENTCOM, and discussing war, so it'll be a little bit challenging for me not to be too technical about issues. Many of us alluded on the situation of on the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan in the crisis. There is no doubt that there is a crisis. And as Scott mentioned, I would like to also say that this year and the following, we would have a shortfall of around $2 billion in real terms in humanitarian needs, with $1 billion in acute shortfall, which would mean many Afghans, and in millions we are talking here, would not have access to basic services like health and basic needs, including sanitation and livelihood. So that is the situation. But before coming to short-term and long-term goals, and as discussed before too, I'd like to challenge a narrative that is being discussed and proposed in Doha and in the surrounding avenues too, that there may be an economic recovery to pre-2021 or even better to that by undermining or undercutting human rights and women's rights issues. And I would like to challenge this and say, while it's critical to address the humanitarian needs, let us not create the false hope that we can tackle economy and political issues separately. This should be a whole of international community and whole of systematic approach. And I'm giving just 2 or 3 reasons and facts. First of all, there's also plenty of literature about the South Africa apartheid era, that there was an era of economic growth, but later on we saw how that economic growth really was undermining certain sections of the population, and how historically it masked deep inequalities. The same goes with Afghanistan. You cannot have economic recovery while undermining majority of the population, while I always go out loud and say there is feminization of poverty in Afghanistan. When your government civil servants who are not even coming to the offices and are restricted in terms of mobility are ordered to be paid less than $100 a month, that is feminization of poverty. When you're restricted to go out and make a living as a woman, that is feminization of poverty. What kind of economic growth or recovery path will you be seeking if you're restricting more than half of your population? And in terms of long-term approach, you cannot put forward an economic recovery plan if half of your population does not have a say, if they are deprived of education at this point. So even if you talk in terms of economic models, that we economists are very interested in those crazy graphs, you do not have a path, a sustainable path. Second, and I do talk about lack of accountability. Any system, be it political, economic, require robust check and balances. And economy does too. I see currently there is no path, whether it is domestic or international, for accountability in Afghanistan towards the Taliban, or a Taliban towards the domestic population or international community. I know they give this reason. They do not have a seat in the United Nations. They are not part of the international conference system or economic system. I heard one of their representatives attended COP yesterday. It's going in Azerbaijan, Baku. But they need to be responsible to the basic demands from the international community in population. And I see no readiness from the Taliban side, and they have not shown any gesture that they are accountable to these basic demands. In fact, Scott mentioned about the directives. Out of all those directives that were issued, 71 directives directly impact women's inclusion in the economy or accessing humanitarian needs, which then has other implications. Third, and I'm giving a very recent example, as many international institutions might hail Taliban for raising revenues, or we have heard that the Afghani currency has appreciated against US dollars. I wouldn't say that's a good sign either. You're talking about an economy which is highly informal. It limits the access, the activities of all the informal sector, the private sector, who can produce jobs that will culminate into more unemployment across the country. And then the banking sector itself, despite restrictions from the financial side in international systems, the amount of loss that they have incurred in terms of Afghani appreciation, it's really insurmountable. So there is no check and balances in terms of the fiscal policies, monetary policy, or development policies that Taliban put forward. We can talk about international engagement, international integration, which I have a lot of criticism on the term. Actually, for me, integration comes after normalization, because your relation would be normalized with an institution, with a country, but then they may not be integrated as part of the international system. I think we are putting cart before the horse, that we want to integrate Taliban in the economic and financial system, but we do not normalize. No, that's not how it works. You eventually or inadvertently normalize relationship if they are part of the international system, and that's what they want. So yes, the medium term, I would say, or the short term, unfortunately, is the humanitarian needs that need to be fulfilled. And unfortunately, the programmatic funding for Afghanistan has decreased, and I would like to pinpoint on the fact that this needs attention in the nearest future. But over the long term, unless the political conditions are not met, which I see no improvement, there's no sustainable, and I emphasize on the word sustainable and viable economic recovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Nahi. I'd like to come back to programmatic assistance in a few moments, but first I'd like to talk about the film a little bit, and I'm sorry to not give you a break, Nahid, but I'd like to begin with you. Working in the Afghanistan government, working in a gender minority, significant gender minority in the Afghanistan government, I'd like to hear your thoughts on what you'd like us to take away from at least the segment of the Sharp Edge of Peace. And there's a question from the audience that I'll just link to this, which is that the film, which dances between English and, in the view of this member of the audience, literary Persian. The question is whether, in focusing on those women who became part of the political elite, whether the film is reflecting the needs and views of the majority of Afghans.
Thank you so much, whoever raised this question, because I'm dying to talk about this all the time, you know? Needs and differing voices. Can anyone tell me that those of you sitting in Florida have the same kind of views to those who are sitting in Texas? No. Why do we always expect people in underdeveloped and developing nations to have united in same kind of voice? If you expect us to be a democratic nation and to value democracy, please accept that we have differing voices, and we have to respect that fact that we are a matured nation, and a farmer working in Bamiyan or Helmand might have political opinions on issues as much as me sitting in the Ministry of Finance in Kabul. That being said, not all of us were a result of, well, I appreciate the kind of partnerships that Afghanistan had with international community, especially the support from the United States that was the backbone of many developments that happened over the past 20 years. Not all of us came or were raised from the streets of New York, DC, or Florida. I was born and raised in Afghanistan. I went in, my first experience of being a refugee was in Pakistan when I was 11 years old. I came back, I studied, I went, and I worked in Afghanistan. Same as I remember Ms. Kofi, who was featured in the documentary. She was an English, or if I'm not mistaken, or a computer teacher in Badakhshan, and she raised to that power through a lot of efforts, and where she is today, or she was there. So yes, we were, I would say, in a bubble of elitism, as many are in certain countries, because it's very hard to close the gap of urban, or as they say, or rural, or the poverty gap, while you're fighting development challenges and also military challenges at the same time. But we should also appreciate that there are differing views, and my want to extend opportunities for myself doesn't contain others to have opportunity. And that's what we wanted from the peace process. We did not want schools to remain open while undercutting somebody else's rights. We are trying to extend those rights. And I don't think there was anything wrong with that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I've invited the panelists to ask questions of each other. We'd like to generate some discussion. So please do raise a finger if you have a question for one of your colleagues. Another question from the audience, which I'll share here, let's say as a piece of information for what our audience is hearing, and we can respond or take it in stride. This question states, Halima, you opened with a strong critique of the application of Afghanistan within the international liberal human rights rubric, the script. Most of the rest of the panel applied that script in your responses to the realities in Afghanistan. And there's a request that we expand on that. But so I'm going to ask you, I'm going to pause not to interfere with the question, but to take it as something that might help our thinking with a couple of other things that have come up. Okay, so first, let's talk about programmatic aid. Let's talk about international aid to Afghanistan. We've talked this morning about history, about the past, long history, recent history. I'd like to focus for a moment on the immediate present. Can any of you provide us with examples of aid in Afghanistan, small scale, large scale, across sectors, that you feel is really working within a tolerable level of compliance without conceding what we've described as red lines, and that you'd like to highlight for the audience today? It can be a project, it can be a concept, it can be a funding opportunity. Ambassador Jawad.
Thank you very much, an excellent question. Again, we talked about the challenges, the difficulties, but there's a lot of actually heroic work is also taking place in Afghanistan that we should recognize. There are, from bigger organizations to small NGOs, who are doing very hard work in Afghanistan despite incredible challenges. Especially, I emphasize the need and the demand for education in Afghanistan. Some of the institutions of higher education are still operating under a lot of constraint and are careful about indicating their activities. When they open actually enrollment for a semester of students for 200 to 300 students, they get application within the first day of over 20,000. So the thirst for education, for knowledge is there. And there's a lot of real heroic work taking place, even in difficult places like in Kandahar, where I am from. Small NGOs, women groups, and others are organizing, implementing education program. Despite incredible challenges, you cannot even imagine that you're running a small, actually, aid project, and then the Taliban will come and ask if all your female staff are married or not. And if they're not married, why they're not married. And what can you do to get them married? It's a very, very challenging environment to operate, but there is work. I think the most important investment that could be made in addition to the severe humanitarian crisis on the long term is to invest in education in Afghanistan. We lost actually a big portion of the human capital that we have through the fall of Afghanistan, through the plans that we thought was very good for Afghanistan, evacuating Afghans and other, but we deprived also Afghans from the capacity that was created there. And that should continue. Again, a number of those Afghans who have now been outside Afghanistan, forced as refugee or evacuated even, they will go back if their condition permit. I was one of them. I left Afghanistan because of the Soviets invasion, but after 9/11, I returned when there was opportunity. So these Afghans will return. That's the investment that we are making, especially for educational programs inside Afghanistan, is very, very critical to keep actually the human capital that's been created in Afghanistan and to hope actually for better days for the future of Afghanistan. One short thing is actually, when I was speaking of that, I just want to add very short brief. During the discussions in the morning was mentioned disappointment with the Afghan National Security Forces. Although General McKenzie kindly alluded to how the infrastructure was actually taking away underneath their feet. It's hundreds of thousands of Afghan National Security Forces died or were maimed. There may be programs wrong that their numbers were exaggerated or something like that, but they fought. They fought for Afghanistan. They fought alongside you. And I was actually in June, July, leading to August withdrawal. Again, I was in Moscow. And not only Ambassador Khalilzad or General Miller were recommending that the bloodshed should stop and the fighting should diminish, but also the contracts. It was an army designed by supporting by contractors. The contracts were withdrawn. The contracts could have been assigned or transferred to Afghans and other. It was not. The ANDS relied heavily on Air Force supply, an American design, and ineffective when you have the resources. And those resources were withdrawn. So it was not the lack of courage or willingness to fight for Afghanistan. It was a wrong narrative that was introduced that everything will work out. Nothing is final until everything is final. And also out of goodwill, probably the suggestion was for not the ANDSF to put themselves in the harm way while the support that existed underneath their system was withdrawn. So we, as an Afghan, again, I always respect and accept their sacrifices. And I think when they were called for the duty, they performed. We could have done well, of course. Both that the security forces and other Afghan leaders, are they in fault as we are? There's, again, when we discuss about this issue, like lesson learned in the past, a lot of things wrong with us Afghans, a lot of things wrong with Americans. But to resolve this issue is not actually Afghans trying to blame Americans for what went wrong or American to blame Afghans for what went wrong. We should look at internally among ourselves. We had all these failures as Afghans, and our partners and allies actually could have done things betterly. Thank you.
I think we all really appreciate that recognition, Ambassador. Halima and then Scott.
I think just to think about what the question was about, where is the much of the work coming from in aid? I see as part of that, and a significant part of that, are individuals who are working to provide aid on very small scale in Afghanistan as very effective, because there's still quite a lot of distrust from past systems and even current systems, and there is quite a lot of corruption still within the Taliban ranks and the aid distribution that the media can't cover because journalists can't do their jobs the way they used to do. So the assumption that there's no corruption or there's very little of it is wrong. And then as far as education for girls, I mean, Ian, you know this, we've been working on this for quite a long time, the Alliance for the Education of Women of Afghanistan, which is an AUAF partnership, and I'm on the steering committee of it. It's aewa.org, and I point that out because it is actually an alliance that brings together educational service providers, mostly for girls and women, inside Afghanistan and in the diaspora. And basically the alliance, what it does is it's replicating the Ministry of Higher Education in exile. We've created standards for all of these service providers. We're creating accreditation, continuity in the systems, the educational systems of the West. So this dire human rights situation and humanitarian situation in Afghanistan is actually encouraging innovation in these kinds of conflict settings, which we think that the AWA model could be used in different areas, even potentially in Palestine or in different conflict areas. So even within these dire situations, I look at the hope and the possibility, and there's innovation there. So I would do want to point that out, because we are a panel for human rights and humanitarian aid, and there is hope there. And just a last point on this, at the Hoover Institution, I have the U.S. Afghan War Archive that I'm building with General H.R. McMaster, and I've interviewed dozens and dozens of former Afghan military, and I agree with Ambassador Jawad. I've interviewed our fighter pilots, our Afghan fighter pilots, who fought till the last day, flying out with broken helicopters, very little gas, just to make it back and make it alive. I do not think that the blame should be on the Afghan security forces. And I speak confidently from recording hundreds of hours with our Afghan security forces, as well as US security forces.
Thank you, and thank you for mentioning the alliance, which we believe reaches beneficiaries in the many, many tens of thousands now, and only growing, representing 70 organizations from grassroots to major US universities like Stanford and Arizona State. Scott, please.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to come back to one of the premises of the question and the concept of whether there's a Western imposition of either governance or rights, and was it too liberal? I was interpreting that question, or not. Maybe that can be a debate in terms of lessons learned. But in terms of going forward, I do want to underscore again that what the Taliban are doing on rights, on women's rights in particular, is really unprecedented. There's no country in the world now, and I'm not aware of it in modern history, that is prohibiting by law girls above 6th grade from going to public school. That is not a liberal value, a Western value, that's a universal value. I also mentioned, it's useful to have the UN rights framework and the work that Richard Bennett is doing as a lens. That is indeed signed on by the vast majority of countries, including Muslim majority countries. So it's important to benchmark, and as we measure what the Taliban are doing, as we articulate goals and conditions for different levels of engagement or recognition, these are really not Western values, they're universal values. The other thing I would say on that, that I did not mention before, is in addition to looking at diplomatic processes now, I think it is really important to focus on the different international accountability mechanisms that are available by treaty and otherwise. And so I'll mention a few. One, the International Criminal Court is actively investigating the Taliban for the crime against humanity of gender persecution. Hopefully there will be some kind of announcement on that relatively soon. There is this debate ongoing that I think is very productive, looking at whether gender apartheid can and should be codified as a crime against humanity. That's a long process, but it's important to put a marker down for the international community that says what's going on here is extraordinary and wrong. Furthermore, there's an International Court of Justice process looking at violations of the Convention against forms of discrimination against women. Hopefully that can move forward. And I would also mention, at a lesser level, but the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, they have had meetings about Afghanistan. I understand that there's at least very private frustration with how the Taliban have been applying and interpreting Sharia law. So having a fatwa or something equivalent come out of that community would also be a way of underscoring the aberrance of the Taliban's policies and grounding this in a more universal value than something that could be labeled as Western or foreign.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you. And thank you to our panelists. We're sadly out of time, but it is also time for lunch. I'd like to say just one word in conclusion. Problems may seem insurmountable, but just on this stage, you see the level of intellect and commitment devoted to solving the problems that we share and face together, and that should encourage all of us. In addition to our panelists, I'd like to say one more word, one last time, to thank Ambassador Greta Holtz for bringing us together. I know she's viewing online, and we're all very grateful both to her, to our organizers, and to the university. Thank you very much.